There are worlds that shine like jewels, worlds where oceans sing beneath clean skies and the air carries the scent of life. And then there is Barbarus, a world where the sky never clears, where light is a memory, where the mountains stretch higher than reason and the valleys are filled not with rivers, but with poison. The air itself is death, thick, pale, and heavy. It moves like breath, but it kills like a blade. Only the dead can walk freely on Barbarus. And so, the dead rule it, high above the choking mists in the peaks where the toxins thin. The warlords of Barbarus built their keeps, giants wrapped in rusted armor, creatures of rot and bone and metal. They called themselves men once, long ago, before the fog remade them into monsters. They looked down upon the world below and saw only prey. They would descend into the poison clouds to harvest what lived, the ragged remnants of humanity that crawled and coughed in the toxic mud. They dragged them back up the mountains to die as slaves, to be tested, tortured, and transformed. And every few generations, one of their victims refused to die. One of them survived the poison long enough to rise. From such horror, legends are born. Mortarion was one of these. He was not born. He arrived, fallen like a meteor from the heavens, a child wrapped in smoke. The warlord who found him took him as a curiosity, a strange thing that breathed the deadly air as though it were clean. The creature raised him in his high fortress of bone, teaching him cruelty, teaching him strength, but never love. Mortarion grew among the dead, watching the mists below and wondering what lay within them. He could see movement there, the faint shapes of humans still living, still fighting to survive in the world that had forgotten them. And one day he climbed down into the fog to see for himself. He found pain. He found coughing and rot. He found people who could barely breathe. But they were human. They were alive. And in that poisoned wasteland, Mortarion discovered something his master had never taught him: compassion. He built crude masks to help the weak breathe. He gathered them in bands. He taught them to fight. Each time he climbed back up the mountain to strike against the lords above, he went higher. He fought harder. He learned faster. And each time he returned to the mists, he carried more scars and more followers. He became the spirit of vengeance to the people below, the Lord of Death, a warrior who could walk where none could breathe, a man whose hatred burned hotter than poison. He freed village after village, driving the warlords further into their citadels. And when at last he reached the base of his own master's fortress, he climbed higher than he ever had before. The air grew thinner, the poison weaker. He could see the stars through the fog. And then, for the first time in his life, he saw something else. Light. Clean light. Pure. Golden. And it burned him, not his flesh, his pride, because he knew in that moment that there were beings beyond his reach, that even if he conquered every warlord on Barbarus, he would never stand in that light, not while it belonged to someone else. That light came from a ship, a shape vast and radiant, descending through the poisonous sky like a sun-given form. And from it came the Emperor. He had come to claim another lost son, another Primarch scattered by fate. When Mortarion saw him, tall, shining, untouchable, he knew instantly what he was. He did not kneel. He did not speak. He only stared. The Emperor offered him a hand, a promise, a place among the stars. Mortarion accepted, but something inside him, something small and human, died in that moment. Because no matter how strong he became, he had needed to be saved. And Mortarion hated being saved. The Emperor helped him ascend the mountain one final time, to slay the last of Barbarus's lords. But at the peak, the air grew too pure for Mortarion's lungs. He faltered. He choked. He fell to his knees, the poison-born warrior gasping in clean air. And it was the Emperor, not Mortarion, who struck the killing blow. In that instant, Mortarion learned the taste of humiliation. It was not bitter. It was sour, like rot beneath the tongue. He had wanted to prove he was stronger than death. Instead, he learned that there was always someone greater. When the Emperor carried him back through the fog, Mortarion did not speak. He followed. He obeyed. But in his silence, something festered. The child of a poisoned world had seen a god, and in that god's perfection he found his first infection: envy. Barbarus faded into myth, but its lessons never left him. That endurance is holiness, that suffering is strength, that the purest air is poison to those born in filth. Mortarion would remember, and one day he would return that lesson to the galaxy. When Mortarion left Barbarus, he thought he had escaped death. He thought the poison was behind him, but some poisons do not live in the air. They live in the heart. They linger. They whisper. And Mortarion carried his with him into the stars. To the Emperor, he was another lost son returned, one of 20 scattered across the galaxy, now gathered to lead the Great Crusade. Each of the Primarchs was magnificent in his own way. Some were brilliant, others radiant, some terrible, some kind. Mortarion was none of these. He was endurance. He was patience given flesh. He was the will to keep walking when the body had already died. He did not smile. He did not laugh. He did not sing with his brothers or join in their boasts. He simply worked. Every breath he took aboard the Emperor's ship was an act of endurance. The air was too clean, too sterile, too light. He had spent his life breathing poison, and now the absence of it made him feel exposed, like a wound that would not close. The Emperor, in his wisdom, gave Mortarion command of the 14th Legion. They had once been called the Dusk Raiders, named for the hour they struck, when light faded and hope went with it. They were known for their discipline, their grim resolve, and their silence. They were not glorious like the Blood Angels, nor zealous like the Word-Bearers, nor cunning like the Alpha Legion. They were steady, patient, relentless. They were, in truth, already his reflection, and when Mortarion saw them, he felt something stir in the hollow place where pride should have been. Not joy, not love. Recognition. He taught them the lessons of Barbarus. That endurance was the highest virtue, that comfort was corruption, that suffering was not a curse, but a teacher. He marched with them into hellish war zones, and breathed the poisons that killed others. He stripped his sons of ornament and color, no gold, no jewels, only dull gray and pale bone, the colors of death and decay. He told them, "You will walk through death and you will not stop." And they did. World after world fell before them. Planets choked by disease, saturated in toxins, wreathed in decay. These were the worlds others feared. But to the Death Guard, they were home. They walked where others could not. They fought in silence. They won through suffering, and in every victory Mortarion felt a cold satisfaction. Not pride. Pride was for the pure, but a dark comfort that endurance itself was divine. His brothers admired him, but few understood him. To Fulgrim he was crude, to Guilliman too harsh, to Angron too restrained, to Perturabo a kindred spirit and but one without joy, and to Horus he was a weapon. Horus saw in Mortarion something honest, something incorruptible, a man who despised weakness more than he feared death. That honesty would make him useful. But Mortarion saw Horus differently. He saw the favored son, the golden one, the one who breathed the same clean air as the Emperor and called it his birthright. Mortarion did not hate Horus then. He envied him. And envy, like rot, does not need to grow fast. It only needs to begin. The Great Crusade burned across the stars. The Emperor's vision spread. Worlds enlightened, civilizations brought to heel, chaos purged. But for Mortarion, it was not enlightenment. It was conquest. It was control under another name. He watched his father speak of unity and progress, watched him raise monuments of gold, and felt that old bitterness rise again. He remembered the clean air on Barbarus that had nearly killed him. He remembered the hand that had saved him when he wanted to save himself. And in the Emperor's perfection, Mortarion saw the same tyranny as the lords he had slain. The same light, the same pride, the same certainty that others were lesser. He began to whisper to himself, "He is no different. He only wears a cleaner mask." When the Crusade ended for the day, the Death Guard did not celebrate. They cleaned their weapons, they buried their dead, they inhaled the fumes of the battlefields like incense. Mortarion would stand at the edge of the camps, his eyes on the stars, his armor stained with ash, and feel nothing. No victory, no peace. Only the slow, familiar ache of breathing air that wasn't his. The Legion loved him, but they did not understand him. To them, he was the perfect commander, endless, tireless, a lord who walked beside them through every storm. But to himself he was a stranger, a man too human for the gods and too monstrous for men. The Emperor saw his son's distance but said nothing. He believed that time would heal the wound between them. He believed that Mortarion's hatred of tyranny was the shadow side of his love for humanity. But Mortarion did not love humanity. He pitied it. And pity, when it curdles, becomes contempt. He believed that men must learn through pain, that weakness must be burned out through endurance, that only those who survive deserve to live. He had turned his suffering into philosophy, and that philosophy had turned into faith. Faith in decay, faith in struggle, faith in the slow purification of pain. And the universe, as it always does, was listening. Something ancient and swollen with laughter had heard his prayers long before he knew he was praying. Something that would answer him in time. For now, the Death Guard marched. World after world, year after year, breathing in the rot of war and exhaling victory. They left behind no beauty, no monuments, only peace, the kind that follows extinction. And as Mortarion stood in the silence after every campaign, he wondered why victory always smelled like the poison winds of home. Before they were the Death Guard, they were the Dusk Raiders, a name taken from the Terran campaigns, where warriors of the 14th Legion struck as the sun fell below the horizon, when light itself hesitated between day and night. They were soldiers of silence, born in the ruins of old Earth when war had become the only constant language. Even before Mortarion found them, they fought with a calmness that unnerved their enemies. They did not shout, they did not chant. They simply advanced, a slow, inevitable tide of gray and iron. Where others sought glory, they sought completion. Where others burned with zeal, they burned with patience. They were not fast, they were not graceful, but they did not die. That was their gift. That was their curse. When the Emperor brought Mortarion to them, the match was instant, as though the Legion had been waiting for him all along. He saw in them the endurance of the downtrodden. They saw in him the strength of the unbreakable. And together they became one philosophy made flesh. Mortarion did not demand loyalty through love. He demanded it through shared suffering. He marched beside them, breathing the same poisoned air, fighting in the same mud, enduring the same wounds. He never asked for obedience. He expected it, and they gave it freely. Because they knew their Primarch would never ask them to do anything he would not do himself. And that kind of leadership forges faith more unyielding than any sermon. The 14th Legion became known as the Lords of Endurance. Their armor was stripped of color, a drab gray-green that blended with the battlefield's ash. Their banners were plain, their oaths were simple, their victories were absolute. Where they went, plagues followed, not of corruption but of attrition. They did not strike fast, they did not retreat. They waded through war like men walking through rain, unimpressed by death's persistence. If the air was toxic, they adapted. If the ground burned, they marched barefoot. If the enemy released gas, They inhaled it and advanced. There were stories of enemies sealing themselves in fortresses, only to open their gates weeks later to find the Death Guard still waiting, standing silent in the smoke, unmoving, unyielding. To fight them was not to die quickly, it was to drown slowly. Mortarion taught them philosophy as much as strategy. He said, "Purity is a lie told by the comfortable. Endurance is truth because pain does not lie," and they believed him. He taught them that strength was not measured in power but in persistence, that those who do not die cannot be defeated. And so the Legion learned to embrace decay not as weakness, but as nature. Armor rusts, flesh fails, stone cracks, stars burn out. Everything dies, but death itself endures. They found serenity in this. They called it acceptance, and through that acceptance they found peace, a peace made of exhaustion and inevitability. Among the other legions, the 14th were respected but rarely loved. To the Blood Angels, they were joyless. To the Ultramarines, unrefined. To the Iron Hands, too human. But when the galaxy needed something done, something no one else could endure, the Death Guard were sent. They fought the wars that no one else wanted, the long sieges, the attritional slogs through poison and plague, the slow exterminations that broke morale and shattered hope. And when they won, as they always did, they did not celebrate. They simply moved on, one battle closer to the next, one breath closer to silence. Mortarion's command halls were quiet. He disliked speeches, he preferred action. His officers learned that silence was respect, that stillness was discipline, and that fatigue was holy. Every scar was a mark of faith, every infection a testament of will. Their apothecaries learned to leave wounds half-healed. Their armorers learned to favor reliability over beauty. To them, a shining blade was vanity, a rusted one that still killed truth. The Legion's culture became a religion of decay. On campaign, they would bury their dead not to honor them, but to remind the living that flesh is temporary. They spoke of entropy as a friend, not an enemy, of rot as the natural end of all pride. To outsiders, it looked like despair. To them, it was serenity, because when you accept that everything breaks, you are never broken. That was the Death Guard's secret, and yet beneath this stoic faith there was something darker. The more Mortarion preached endurance, the more his sons began to worship him. They saw him not just as their commander, but as a prophet of pain. He warned them not to idolize him. He told them he was no god. But his words, his philosophy became their litany, and their discipline, their silence, was mistaken for purity. But inside that silence there was fear. The fear of weakness, the fear of failing him, the fear of not enduring enough, and fear even when buried, even rots. As the Great Crusade continued, the 14th Legion became the hammer of inevitability. They conquered planets poisoned by radiation where even the air turned to acid. They waged sieges for years without rest, watching entire civilizations rot under their gaze. And each time the smoke cleared, Mortarion would stand among the corpses, breathing in the stench and whisper, not in triumph, but in recognition. Because he had found it again, the same smell that haunted his dreams, the scent of Barbarus. He had carried his home with him across the stars, and the galaxy would come to smell like it too. The stars burned bright in those days. The galaxy was vast and full of promise, and humanity marched to reclaim it. The Emperor's sons led the way, 20 demigods of war, each a mirror of their father's vision, each a fragment of his perfection. The Death Guard were among the most relentless. They did not falter. They did not fail. They did not stop. To the other legions, war was a symphony, a display of brilliance, strategy, and glory. To the Death Guard, war was labor, a task to be done, endured, and forgotten. They moved like a slow storm, When the Death Guard came, the skies dimmed, the air thickened, and the soil grew heavy with the scent of iron and decay. They did not rush. They did not charge. They advanced in perfect lines across ash plains and ruined cities behind the unshakable rhythm of their bolters. They were death, not as an act, but as a condition of nature. When the sons of Guilliman rebuilt, the sons of Mortarion cleansed. When the sons of Russ roared, the Death Guard exhaled quietly and went about their work. And when the war was done, they left nothing behind but silence. On the world of Adristan, the air was toxic enough to melt skin. 3 legions refused to deploy there. Mortarion and his sons volunteered. They walked through storms of acid rain with hoods drawn low, their armor steaming as chemicals hissed across ceramite. They fought for 7 days in total blindness, guided only by sound and stubbornness. When the campaign was over and Adrastan's cities lay silent beneath green fog, the Death Guard remained standing. Their armor corroded, their lungs scarred, their morale unbroken. It was said that even the planet itself grew tired of trying to kill them. Mortarion stood at the heart of these campaigns, his scythe silence always in motion. His presence felt long before it was seen. He fought as if each swing were an act of penance. He breathed poison as if it were prayer. To his sons, he was a vision of what they could become. To his brothers, he was a reminder of what they could never be. During the height of the Crusade, Horus would speak to him often. They would walk the silent decks of their fleets together, speaking softly, not of glory, but of burdens. Mortarion did not smile often, but in Horus's company he would sometimes allow himself a small breath of ease. Horus was the only one who seemed to understand. The weight of expectation, the ache of being shaped by another's will. Horus was light where Mortarion was shadow, but both were bound by the same chain, the Emperor's perfection. And when Horus spoke of freedom, freedom from gods, from tyrants, from destiny, Mortarion listened. He did not yet believe, but the words stayed with him, like the aftertaste of a toxin too faint to notice. Under Mortarion's rule, the Death Guard perfected their doctrine of endurance through suffering. Their apothecaries learned to embrace infection rather than fear it. Their surgeons studied decay as though it were scripture. Their ships reeked of oil, smoke, and chemical preservatives. To outsiders, they looked diseased. To themselves, they were purified. Each scar was proof of devotion, each cough a hymn, each breath a defiance of weakness. Mortarion did not praise them. He simply expected their strength. Praise was for the living. The Death Guard were beyond such things. When the Emperor walked among his sons, Mortarion always felt it, that faint, almost invisible layer of judgment. The others basked in his radiance. Mortarion stood in his shadow. He knew the Emperor loved none of them as sons. He loved them as tools. And Mortarion had always known what it meant to be a tool, to be useful, then discarded. The old bitterness stirred again, quietly. It did not yet burn. It rotted, and rot, as Mortarion taught, is patient. There were worlds that praised the Death Guard as saviors. But they did not want praise. They did not build shrines, did not carve statues. They left their worlds in ruinous peace and moved on without looking back. They were peacekeepers only in the sense that nothing stirred after their passing. Theirs was not the peace of prosperity, it was the peace of exhaustion, the peace of death. When the War Master called them to fight beside him, Mortarion obeyed. When the Emperor summoned him, he obeyed as well. But in both commands he felt the same thing, the weight of someone else's will pressing down on him. He began to ask questions in private. Why must man be ruled? Why must perfection be worshipped? Why must the weak always bow to the strong if strength is born only from suffering? And deep in the warp something laughed. It was not mockery, it was recognition. a god of filth and joy, of life and death intertwined, heard those questions and began to whisper answers. For now, Mortarion silenced those whispers. He told himself he needed no gods. He had endured worse than divine promises. And so the Death Guard continued their march. Faithful, steady, unstoppable. But the warp was patient. The gods were patient. And Mortarion, without knowing it, had already started to pray. When the Great Crusade reached its golden age and the Emperor turned his eyes back toward Terra to build his empire of reason, Mortarion watched him go and felt the same feeling he had felt on Barbarus, that the air around him had become too clean. He looked at the worlds his legion had conquered, the empires they had buried, the silence they had sown across the stars, and for the first time, he wondered what it was all for. Victory without rest, peace without purpose, endurance without end. Perhaps this was his father's perfection after all. And if so, perhaps perfection was just another word for decay. Decay does not begin with collapse. It begins with stillness. With the moment something stops growing and starts waiting. Mortarion did not notice the change at first. None of them did. The Death Guard marched as they always had. World after world fell beneath their patient advance. Victory after victory stacked upon their weary shoulders. And yet, something in the air had changed. The silences between battles grew longer. The stars themselves seemed colder. And Mortarion began to dream. He had never dreamed before, not truly. Sleep had always been an act of recovery, not imagination. But now, when he closed his eyes, he saw a garden. It was not a place of beauty, at least not in any human sense. Its trees were swollen and dripping with rot. Its rivers were thick with filth and life intertwined. Flies the size of fists drifted lazily through mist that shimmered like fever. And at the garden's center, he could hear laughter. Not cruel laughter, not mocking, but soft, amused, kind. A father's laugh, the kind that follows after a child's mistake. Each time Mortarion awoke, he would remember the sound and feel something heavy in his chest, a warmth he could not name. He told himself it was nothing, a dream born of exhaustion, a trick of the warp. But the dreams came again and again. Sometimes he walked through the garden. Sometimes he simply stood and breathed the air that smelled of home, of Barbarus, of the mists he had once thought he'd escaped. There was something familiar in it, something comforting, something that felt like belonging. And Mortarion, who had never belonged anywhere, did not know whether to fear that feeling or cling to it. The whispers began soon after, not voices, not at first, just thoughts that did not sound like his own. When he looked upon his brother's triumphs, he felt them. When he stood before the Emperor's statues, he heard them. He is not your father. You are not his son. You were made to endure, not to serve. He would shake the thoughts away, but they returned, patient, persistent, like the hum of insects in the dark. They never shouted. They never demanded. They only suggested. And the longer he listened, the more reasonable they sounded. The Death Guard themselves began to change. Their bodies were strong, but the years of toxic campaigns had taken their toll. Scars that never healed, coughs that lingered, armor that rusted no matter how often it was cleaned. But they did not complain. They wore their decay like medals. They told themselves that pain was holiness, that endurance was victory. Mortarion saw this and felt pride and pity. His sons believed what he had taught them, and perhaps that was the cruelest thing of all, because their faith made them blind. They did not notice how the air around them seemed thicker, how their ship's hold smelled faintly of mold and blood, how sometimes in the quiet between campaigns they could hear something breathing. When Mortarion walked the decks of his flagship, the Endurance, he sometimes felt as though the walls themselves were watching him. Condensation formed where there should be none. Rust bloomed on steel that had been polished only days before, and the air carried a sweetness, not pleasant, but nostalgic. It reminded him of childhood, of the mountains of Barbarus where decay was constant but never cruel. He began to wonder if perhaps purity had been the lie all along. If perhaps decay was not death, but the truth of all things. He tried to speak to his brothers about it once, to Guilliman, who spoke of order and structure, to Lorgar, who whispered of faith and divinity, to Horus, who listened more than he spoke. Each offered him comfort. Each missed the point. Guilliman told him to focus on discipline. Lorgar told him decay was sin. Horus told him that the Emperor would never understand what they suffered for him. And of the three, Horus's words were the ones that stayed. He sits upon his throne in perfection, Horus said, while we bleed and rot in his name. Mortarion said nothing, but he remembered the clean air that had once burned his lungs, and he wondered if perhaps Horus was right. The whisper in his dreams grew bolder. It began to speak in words he could almost understand. You endure because you were meant to. All things break. I only make the breaking gentle. Come see the truth beneath the rot. When he asked the voice its name, it only laughed. Names are for mortals. I am patience. I am acceptance. I am what you already believe in. He stopped asking after that. There were signs on the battlefield too. Where the Death Guard fought, strange flora began to bloom. Fungal growths rising in the wake of their passing, feeding on the blood-soaked soil. Wounded soldiers reported feeling stronger after infection. Dead ones refused to rot cleanly. Their bodies would fester yet not decay entirely, as if something in the flesh refused to let go. The apothecaries studied it. They found no pathogen, no disease that could be named. They called it a miracle of resilience. Mortarion called it proof. He began to believe that endurance was not just a discipline, but a gift. When word came that Horus had turned against their father, Mortarion did not act immediately. He did not rage. He did not condemn. He waited. He told himself he was searching for truth. But what he was really doing was deciding which lie he preferred. The lie of perfection, or the lie of freedom. And somewhere deep in the warp, the voice that had whispered to him for so long smiled. Because decay does not demand faith. It only waits for you to stop pretending you are pure. It did not begin with fire, it began with silence. The galaxy had grown too quiet. Messages delayed, orders unclear. Brother turning against brother beneath the cloak of secrecy. Mortarion heard rumors before he heard the truth, that Horus had fallen, that the War Master had turned upon their father, that the Emperor's dream was unraveling. He listened in stillness. He did not rush to judgment. He simply breathed and remembered. Remembered the clean air that had nearly killed him. Remembered the golden light that had burned his pride. Remembered how he had been saved against his will. And in the cold chambers of the Endurance, where rust had begun to bloom along the steel, Mortarion felt something stir. Not outrage, not shock, but recognition. Perhaps he thought the rot had only come home. When Horus's summons reached him, it was not a command. It was an invitation. Brother, the message said, the Emperor would have us chained to his perfection forever. But you know what it is to suffer. You know that purity is a lie. Walk with me, and together we will make a galaxy that endures. Mortarion read the words again and again. They were clever. They were tempting. But they were also familiar, because somewhere beneath them he heard another voice, older, softer, and far more patient. You do not follow him. You simply walk the path you were always meant to. Mortarion called his captains together. Silence filled the chamber. The air smelled faintly of oil and fungus. "Brothers," he said, "the galaxy rots. The Emperor sends us to die for ideals he no longer practices. We cleanse worlds of impurity while he builds a throne of gold." His words were not fiery, they were tired, measured, honest. The Death Guard listened and nodded. They did not crave rebellion, they craved truth. And Mortarion gave them a truth they could endure. "We will not kneel to chaos. We will not kneel to the Emperor. We will kneel to nothing. We will stand alone." The Death Guard cheered, a quiet cheer, as was their way. None of them saw the irony, because in that very moment they were already kneeling, not to gods, but to the inevitable. When the Death Guard joined Horus, they did not do so with joy. They did it with resignation. They believed they were freeing themselves from hypocrisy. But in truth, they were simply trading one kind of servitude for another. The Emperor had ruled them with light. Horus would rule them with reason. And behind them both, unseen, another master smiled in the dark. A god who ruled through acceptance. At first, the Death Guard fought the Loyalists with the same discipline that had defined them for centuries. They won battles. They held lines. They burned worlds that refused to bend. But as the war stretched on, the strain began to show. Their ships, once austere and clean, grew foul. Their weapons rusted faster than they could be maintained, supplies spoiled, air filters clogged, wounds festered that should have healed. The apothecaries were baffled. No contagion could explain it. No material defect could be found. It was as though the universe itself had begun to turn against them. But Mortarion said nothing. He simply endured, because endurance had always been his answer. During the siege of Galaspar, Mortarion led his sons into a fortress choked with gas. The defenders released their stockpiles of toxins into the air, turning the world into a storm of death. The other legions would have withdrawn. The Death Guard advanced. They fought for 7 days and 7 nights in clouds that stripped paint from armor and flesh from bone. When at last they emerged victorious, their armor was corroded black. Their lungs bled when they breathed. Their eyes burned, but none of them fell, not one. And as Mortarion stood amid the corpses of friend and foe alike, he felt a strange serenity. The air was poison, but to him it smelled like home. He inhaled deeply, and in that breath something old and warm filled his lungs. He began to speak differently after that, slower, softer. His captains noticed that his voice carried a rasp now, as though something lived inside it. His skin grew pale, his armor darker, and a faint mist began to trail behind him as he walked. Still his legion followed. They had always followed. Because faith once planted does not die when poisoned. It simply grows in a new direction. As Horus's rebellion spread, Mortarion told himself it was not corruption. He was not like Lorgar or Fulgrim or the others who had given themselves to the warp's temptations. He was no servant of demons, he was no worshipper. He was simply a man who refused to be ruled. He convinced himself that his sickness was proof of purity, that only through decay could the false shine of the Emperor's perfection be stripped away. He believed that rot revealed truth, that death was the great equalizer, that even gods would wither if left long enough to time. It was philosophy, it was logic, it was decay disguised as reason. The Death Guard became known as the Pale Host. They no longer moved as men, but as inevitability. Their presence carried the scent of mold and blood. Their ships left trails of spores in their wake. Worlds that they conquered never recovered. And though Mortarion never spoke of faith, his sons began to pray anyway. Not to the Emperor, not to Horus, not even to the thing that whispered in their dreams. They prayed to the idea of endurance itself, to the truth that suffering was eternal, and therefore so were they. And in the warp, that truth took shape. It gave itself form and a name, and it smiled. By the time the Heresy reached its midpoint, the Death Guard were not yet demons, but they were no longer men. Their eyes were hollow, their breaths shallow, their armor slick with perpetual moisture. They felt no joy, no hatred, only fatigue, and a strange, sacred calm. They had mistaken decay for peace, and that mistake would soon consume them. There are names that echo forever in the halls of the Imperium: Terra, Prospero, Calth. And then there is Isstvan. Isstvan is not a location, it is a scar. Other battles are remembered for glory. Isstvan is remembered for betrayal. What happened there did not just break armies. It broke trust. It broke brotherhood. It broke the idea that loyalist and traitor still meant anything at all. And for the Death Guard, Isstvan was the point of no return. Not because they turned, because they did not hesitate. The chain of atrocities around Isstvan is complex, layered in ashes and lies. But one truth cuts through it. On that world, the War Master made his declaration. Not in speeches, not in banners, in blood. The loyalists who still fought beside Horus, still believed he could be redeemed, still believed the rebellion was a misunderstanding, were assembled and then abandoned, surrounded, executed, buried. Sons of the Emperor slaughtered sons of the Emperor. And the Death Guard were there. They were not shocked. Others were. The Raven Guard recoiled in horror. The Salamanders fought like wounded saints. The Iron Hands howled with rage. But the Death Guard did not react. They advanced. They walked through loyalist lines like slow-moving plague, bolters steady, formation unbroken, eyes empty, not furious, not joyous, just inevitable. That was the most terrifying part. Not their strength, their calm. For the first time, Imperial records began calling them by a new name. Not the Dusk Raiders, not even the Death Guard, but the Tainted. Because everywhere they moved, things began to rot. The ground went soft. Armor lacquer peeled and bubbled. Wounds refused to clot. The Loyalists said it was sorcery. The Death Guard said it was inevitability. The truth was much worse. It was the first quiet caress of Nurgle. To understand what happened on Isstvan, you have to understand what Mortarion believed at that moment. He did not think of himself as a traitor. He thought of himself as a purifier. In his mind, the Emperor had lied, claiming to free humanity while in truth binding it to a single, perfect, unreachable will. Perfection to Mortarion was just a clean mask placed over tyranny. Horus to him was not salvation either. He was a weapon, a means, not an end. But Decay. Decay was honest. Rot does not pretend. Plague does not flatter. Corruption does not lie. It simply reveals what was already weak. So when the order came to turn against those who still served Terra, Mortarion did not see it as betrayal. He saw it as a test of endurance, a test of truth. Who could survive this? Who deserved to? On Isstvan, the air ran thick with ash and metallic dust, burned cities, melted armor, broken gene-forged bodies cooling in toxic rain. The skies glowed red and oily with atmospheric fire. Under that sky, the Death Guard moved in a line, implacable, methodical, absolutely without rush, advancing through abandoned manufactoria, corpse fields, shattered orbital drop zones. All around them, warriors called for mercy, for parley, for reason. Not the Death Guard. They had no sermons left, only work. Bolt, step, exhale, repeat. They moved in silence with the patience of rust. To the Loyalists who survived those hours, it felt like drowning in slow motion. Other legions murdered them in fury. The Death Guard murdered them in fatigue. That was the cruelty. That was the message. It wasn't, "We hate you." It was, "You are already dead." Stop struggling. That is how despair spreads. That is how rot spreads. It convinces you you've already lost. And yet, even in that horror, the Death Guard still believed they were clean. They thought they were using horror, not becoming it. They thought they were making a choice. But their choice had already been made for them because corruption does not always enter through hunger or greed. Sometimes it enters through certainty. The certainty that you see the truth clearly. The certainty that your suffering justifies anything. The certainty that you are above weakness, above compromise, above guilt. That is pride, inverted. That is rot before it smells. And Mortarion had it, deeply. After the massacre, the traitor legions consolidated. Those who'd turned stood together. Those who'd been slaughtered bled out in smoking craters. Voids filled with drifting wreckage. Macro shells still orbiting like dying moons. It should have been the end. It was not. It was only foundation. Because now there was no going back. Not politically, spiritually. You do not walk away from that kind of betrayal and pretend to be what you were before. And so, though the Death Guard still appeared unchanged, their armor still mostly intact, their bodies still mostly human, their souls still speaking like men rather than demons, something inside them had crossed over. They had proven with action that mercy was weakness. They had proven with action that loyalty was conditional. They had proven with action that endurance mattered more than honor, and once a legion believes that, nothing is sacred anymore. Not oaths, not brothers, not themselves. In the days that followed Isstvan, something else began to follow the Death Guard. Flies. At first it was nothing. A nuisance on the air, even inside sealed armor. A hum at the edge of hearing. Then more. Then clouds. Then carpets. Death Guard officers walked through corridors, and flies gathered on the walls in living black stains that pulsed and crawled. Some laughed it off. War filth, they said, spoil of conquest. Others started to cough, slowly, wet, persistent. A few of the Legion's apothecaries attempted to trace it, to purge it, to burn it out. The infection didn't resist, it didn't fight them, it simply endured. Just like them, it waited, just like them, and it smiled, just like the thing in Mortarion's dreams. Mortarion did not speak of guilt after Isstvan. Mortarion did not feel guilt after Isstvan. Guilt, to him, was a moral reflex for men who feared death. He did not fear death. He feared only weakness, failure, dependence, humiliation. Those were the poisons that burned him, and those poisons had been brewing since Barbarus. Isstvan did not corrupt him. It completed him. It gave him permission to become what he already was. That is the horror most people do not understand about corruption. The warp does not make you someone else. It lets you stop pretending. By the time the Death Guard withdrew from Isstvan, the line had been crossed forever. They were no longer the Emperor's 14th Legion. They still wore that number. They still bore that name. But spiritually, they were gone. Their loyalty had shifted, not to Horus, not yet to Nurgle, to the idea that endurance itself was the only law that mattered. That we survived is not just a statement, but a justification for anything. And once that becomes doctrine, plague has already taken root. Here is the quiet truth of Isstvan. Some legions turned for power. Some turned for ambition. Some turned for love or rage or wounded pride. The Death Guard turned because they were tired of bowing to perfection, tired of pretending that suffering wasn't the only honest thing in the galaxy, tired of being asked to die for someone else's purity. They wanted peace, they wanted release, and they thought betrayal would buy it. They were wrong. It would buy them eternity. But eternity is never peace. Not for them. For them, eternity will rot. Forever. The warp does not need to rage to destroy. Sometimes it only needs to wait. After Isstvan, Mortarion and his sons were tasked with a terrible duty, to carry the war deeper into Imperial space, to strike where the Emperor's hand was weakest. The Endurance led a fleet of plague-gray ships, their hulls already dulled by corrosion, their engines coughing like sick lungs. They departed the Isstvan system in silence, the void around them thick with dust and debris, the remains of the massacre still orbiting like iron ghosts. No one celebrated, no one prayed. They simply drifted away as though pulled by something unseen. The voyage was long, too long. What should have been weeks stretched into months, then years. The warp had them. At first it was subtle, a feeling of being watched. The stars flickering wrong, the hum of engines shifting in tone, becoming something almost alive. Then came the sounds, whispers in the corridors, footsteps where none walked, the echo of laughter, faint, distant like someone breathing behind the walls. The Death Guard ignored it. They endured. That was their way. Mortarion walked the decks in silence, his scythe across his back, his mind heavy. He did not sleep anymore. He could not. Every time he closed his eyes, the garden came to him again. It was larger now, brighter, alive in a way that defied words. The air shimmered with spores and golden dust. The laughter was constant. Sometimes he saw shapes in the mist, hulking silhouettes, mocking parodies of life and death intertwined. They beckoned him to walk deeper, to breathe deeper. He would wake gasping, his lungs burning, his throat slick with bile. The crew began to sicken. At first, small things. A cough that didn't heal, a fever that didn't break, a metallic taste in the air, then it spread. Coughs turned to wheezing, flesh cracked beneath armor seals. A wet, sweet odor filled the corridors. Apothecaries worked without rest, but every cure failed. Every remedy turned sour. The infection did not obey medicine. It obeyed despair. And the Death Guard were very good at despair. Mortarion ordered the fleet's Geller fields checked, the barriers that separated Realspace from the warp. The tech priests found them intact, too intact. They pulsed with life, not mechanical life, but organic. Veins of corrosion ran through the machinery, but the veins pulsed, like arteries carrying black blood. The priests recoiled. Mortarion stared. He did not understand it, but he recognized it. It reminded him of home. Weeks passed, then months. The warp refused to release them. Time lost meaning. Clocks stopped. The stars outside turned green and bloated. The ship's hulls sweated oil. The walls grew soft to the touch. The air recycled endlessly, thickening with each breath until it became almost chewable. And still Mortarion refused to believe. He told himself it was a trick of the warp, a punishment from his father, a test from fate. But deep inside he knew. The voice in his dreams had found him. One by one his captains fell ill. They collapsed mid-command, their armor hissing as it bulged and cracked. Their flesh bubbled, their eyes clouded. Their breath came in labored, rattling bursts. And yet, none of them begged for mercy. None of them stopped fighting. They believed this was another test, a trial of endurance. If they suffered long enough, they thought they would be purified again. They did not understand that this was their purification. The contagion spread faster than the warp could flow. Crewmen melted into their armor. Engines fused with veins and fungus. Bolters grew warm in their hands, breathing faintly between shots. Everything was alive. Everything was dying. Everything was perfect. And through it all, Mortarion kept walking step by step through the corpse of his own fleet. His rebreather clogged with phlegm, his armor hissed with corrosion, his bones ached, but he kept moving. Because that is what he had always done. He endured. And then, at the heart of that endless sickness, the voice returned, clear now, rich and low, like laughter through thick fog. You have done well, child. You have suffered honestly. You have never lied about what you are. Mortarion fell to one knee. He could not breathe. His vision swam with rot and gold. You fought for endurance, the voice said, and I am endurance. From the mist a shape emerged, vast, round, overflowing with life and death in equal measure. Flies swarmed around it like stars. Its every breath birthed a new species of plague. Its laughter was kindness given form. "I am the father of Decay," it said, "and you, my son, have finally come home." Mortarion tried to resist. He screamed through blood and bile. He raised his scythe against the vision, against the god. But the weapon was too heavy. His arms were too weak, and the laughter did not stop. It filled him, it filled the ship, it filled the legion. The Death Guard fell one by one, writhing, coughing, breaking, and then becoming. Their skin split but did not bleed. Their bones twisted but did not break. Their lungs filled but did not drown. They did not die. They endured. When the warp finally released them, the fleet drifted in Realspace once more, but they were no longer the same. The ships were covered in fungal growth, their hulls alive and oozing. The crew, what remained of them, were bloated, rotting, but immortal. The Death Guard had survived, and in their survival they had been remade. They had become the Plague Marines. Their Primarch stood among them, his lungs full of poison, his soul full of silence, his body a vessel of pestilence. And for the first time, he felt at peace, because the air was no longer clean, and the pain was gone. Mortarion had endured. He had outlasted gods, brothers, and purity itself. But endurance had betrayed him. It had become devotion. It had become worship. He was not free. He was home. When the warp finally spat them out, the stars were wrong. The galaxy had moved on, the war had grown old. But the Death Guard had not aged. They had swollen. They had ripened. The fleet drifted like a rotting fruit, its hulls pulsing with rot, its engines coughing clouds of plague spores. Every ship in the flotilla was alive. Its veins pumped oil and pus in equal measure. Its walls sweated. Its decks breathed. And the men within them, if they could still be called men, were no longer dying. They had outlived death. They had become its custodians. Mortarion stood at the prow of the Endurance, his scythe silence corroded but whole, his armor blackened and bloated. He did not remember when he had stopped resisting. Only that at some point the act of fighting had begun to feel pointless. What was there to resist? Pain, suffering, death? He had spent his life doing those things. Now they had simply stopped being enemies. He could feel the god's presence everywhere, in every breath, every sound, every ripple of the oily air. Not a voice now. A warmth, a constant suffocating comfort. The Death Guard hailed him as their father reborn. The Death Lord, they called him. The Reaper of the Plague God, the Angel of Rot. But Mortarion felt none of it. No joy, no triumph. Only the heavy quiet of inevitability. He had not chosen this. He had simply stopped struggling. He had wanted to be free of all gods, and so he became one servant. He had wanted to destroy tyranny, and so he became a lord of eternal slavery. The irony was perfect, too perfect, almost divine. When the fleet finally found landfall, it was not a planet in any human sense. It was a wound, a cancerous sphere of perpetual rot, spinning at the edge of the Eye of Terror. Its skies were brown and green, its seas thick as oil, its continents shaped by decay. It breathed. Mortarion felt its heartbeat through the deck. He knew its name before anyone spoke it. The Plague Planet, Nurgle's gift, Nurgle's prison, Nurgle's garden made manifest. They descended through clouds of mold and ash, their ships groaning as if in agony. The air below was warm and wet, heavy with the scent of disease and renewal. Flies the size of tanks drifted lazily through the atmosphere. Fungal forests rose like cathedrals. Rivers of pus reflected the light of a sickly sun, and beneath it all, Mortarion could feel something vast. Roots, veins, arteries, spreading from the planet's core, connecting to the warp itself. It was alive. It was home. When Mortarion walked upon its surface, the ground yielded under his boots like damp flesh. His every step released spores into the air. He looked around at his sons, though their armor blistered, their bodies twisted, their voices now deep and wet with phlegm. And he realized that they no longer needed air filters. They breathed freely, happily. Their lungs were full of the garden's perfume. He watched as they laughed, a sound that had not existed in the Legion for centuries. And for a fleeting moment, Mortarion envied them. He built his fortress upon the tallest mountain. It took centuries, though time meant nothing there. From its peak, he could see the entire world. The plague seas, the forests of bone, the swarms that danced in the air like dust motes in sunlight. He called it the Manse of Dust. Others called it the Cauldron Keep. Within its walls, Mortarion sat in silence, watching the horizon of endless decay. He no longer dreamt of the Emperor. He no longer dreamt of Barbarus. The garden had replaced them both. He had found a kind of peace, a twisted, fungal peace. But peace is not freedom. Peace is only the absence of resistance. And Mortarion had not been freed. He had been absorbed. Nurgle's laughter filled his fortress. It came from the walls, the wind, the rusted bells that hung from his ceiling, each tolling a different disease into being. "My son," the laughter said, "you have learned well. You have learned that all things decay. You have learned that in decay there is no end, only change." Mortarion did not answer. He could not. He had no words left for gods. His legion worshipped him now as much as they worshipped Nurgle. They called themselves the Chosen of Endurance. They spread across the warp like mold through a corpse, bringing Nurgle's gifts to 1,000,000 worlds. To them, infection was not punishment. It was revelation. Each disease, each rot, each death was a hymn. And through their faith, Mortarion grew. He became more than flesh, more than ghost, more than man. He became the demon Primarch of Decay. The transformation was not an ascension, it was a drowning. He did not rise into the warp, he sank into it. It filled him from within, turning bone to smoke, flesh to mist, pain to joy. He screamed for the first time in centuries, not in agony, in realization. He understood at last that there was no end, no death, no release, only rot without conclusion, only the eternal wheel of entropy. And at the bottom of that wheel, Nurgle waited, smiling. When Mortarion emerged, he was colossal. His wings were tattered banners of disease. His armor was fused with his own flesh, oozing life with every breath. Flies circled him like stars. His scythe silence had become part of him, a limb of his will. He looked upon his legion, upon his garden, and upon the endless storms of filth that surrounded his world. And he laughed once. A hollow, bitter sound, half defiance, half acceptance. And the plague planet answered back, its winds carrying that laughter to the edge of the Eye of Terror. From that day on, Mortarion ruled as Nurgle's right hand. He waged war not for conquest, but for balance, to remind the galaxy of its mortality. Every world that forgot decay he infected. Every empire that claimed purity he humbled. He did not see himself as a monster. He saw himself as truth. Because in his mind, death was not evil. It was the only honest thing left. In time, Mortarion forgot what he once was, the man who had climbed mountains to free slaves, the child who had defied gods and tyrants alike, the son who had looked upon the Emperor's light and refused to kneel. Now he knelt every day, not in worship but in fatigue. He was tired. He had always been tired, and Nurgle's laughter was always there, reminding him, "Rest, my child. You have earned it, but rest," for Mortarion was just another word for decay. And decay, he knew, never ends. The galaxy healed, but it never forgot the wound. The Heresy had burned itself out in a storm of betrayal and divine fire, leaving behind a universe too scarred to die, too broken to mend. The War Master was gone. The emperor was entombed, and the gods laughed because the war had not ended. It had simply changed shape. Among the Eye of Terror, where reality wept into madness, there was one world that never slept. It breathed, it seethed, it pulsed with the rhythm of rot, the Plague Planet, the garden of the Rotfather, the seat of the Death Lord. From his mountain citadel, Mortarion ruled over legions of decay. The Death Guard had long since stopped pretending to be soldiers. They were carriers, missionaries, each one a walking shrine to infection. They did not speak of conquest anymore. They spoke of communion. To them, spreading Nurgle's gifts was not war. It was generosity, a sacred act of sharing. Every plague they unleashed, every world they drowned in disease, was a hymn to the truth they had learned in agony. That all things end, and in ending, all things are equal. Mortarion rarely left his world. He did not need to. From his mountain throne, he could see the tides of filth rise and fall across the eye. He could feel the beat of 1,000,000 infections blooming like flowers. When he wished to send his sons to war, he simply exhaled, and the winds carried his will. Wherever his breath touched, life changed. Bodies softened, metal corroded, faith collapsed into acceptance. It was not hate that drove him now. It was patience, because patience too is a kind of plague, yet even patience needs purpose. And so Mortarion turned his gaze toward the Imperium, the empire of his father's corpse. He hated it still, not because it lived, but because it pretended to live. The Emperor had not died. He had refused to. His empire worshipped his ruin and called it holiness. To Mortarion, that was the final blasphemy. Decay denied, death postponed, perfection embalmed in gold. He would correct it, not through destruction, through infection. When the Black Crusades began, the Death Guard were always there, not leading the charge. That was Abaddon's role, the heir to Horus's fury. No, Mortarion moved like disease moves, quietly, everywhere, unseen until it was too late. His fleets would appear without warning, their arrival heralded by storms of rot and fog. Planets would send distress calls, and by the time help arrived, the cities were already swollen with plague. Walls melted, citizens sang in fever, priests preached to crowds that were already dead. And in the center of it all, a towering figure in rusted armor, scythe in hand, watched in silence. He never spoke. He never gloated. He simply turned away, leaving the infection to finish his sermon. Mortarion's wars were not wars of conquest. They were reminders. He did not seek territory. He sought understanding. To him, every civilization that worshipped purity was a denial of nature. Every empire that promised progress was another version of the Emperor's lie. So he gifted them his truth, disease as balance, suffering as enlightenment, death as mercy. Those who died quickly he pitied, those who endured he blessed. Across the millennia, the Death Guard perfected the art of corruption. They developed plagues that could whisper, spores that could dream, diseases that killed the soul before they touched the body. Entire worlds were infected before the first symptom appeared. The Imperium called it heresy. Mortarion called it nature. The great corrupter, the Reaper Angel, the Lord of the Pale Wastes. The titles multiplied as the centuries crawled forward, but Mortarion felt nothing for them. For all his power, for all his immortality, he remained what he had always been, a man trapped in air too clean for his lungs. Sometimes in the quiet of his fortress, he would walk alone through the gardens of the Plague Planet. The ground squelched beneath him, trees wept resin and blood. Flowers opened and closed like breathing wounds. And sometimes, if the wind blew a certain way, he could hear faint laughter from the mist. "Are you happy, my child? You are everything I promised you would be." Mortarion never answered. He hated that voice. not because it lied, but because it told the truth too kindly. He had become what he hated, a god's tool, another tyrant with a crown of suffering, but he could not undo it. The rot ran too deep, and even hatred over centuries rots into acceptance. The galaxy turned, empires rose, fell, and rose again, and still Mortarion endured. When demon incursions shook the stars, he did not flinch. When black crusades failed and returned, he did not despair. Because despair is not an ending, it is a rhythm, and for Mortarion, rhythm was eternity. He learned to take comfort in the cycles. Each outbreak, each death, each rebirth was proof that his father's empire still lived, and thus still needed him. He had become indispensable to the galaxy's decay. He was its balance, its reaper, its cure. Yet even immortality carries longing. In moments of stillness, he would look toward the void and think of Barbarus, not as it was, but as he remembered it. A world of fog and death, where he had once believed that he could be free. He would close his eyes and imagine climbing those mountains again, breathing poison that did not hurt, hearing silence that did not laugh. For just a heartbeat, he could almost believe he was mortal again. Then the wind would shift and the garden would breathe and Nurgle's laughter would return. And Mortarion would remember that even dreams decay. They call him many things now. The Death Lord, the Plague Father's hand, the Lord of Decay. But in truth, he is none of these. He is a shadow of a child who once tried to save the dying and became their disease instead. A man who wanted to destroy gods and ended up as one's reflection. The galaxy remembers his name with fear. But fear is not what he wanted. He wanted peace. And the cruelest thing the universe ever gave him was exactly that. Peace, eternal, unending, rotting. For a long time, the galaxy could pretend that the nightmares were mostly gone, that the long war was far away, sealed behind the eye of terror. That demon Primarchs were stories, curses, warnings for frightened worlds. It could pretend that Mortarion was myth. It cannot pretend anymore, because time broke, reality split, and the wound in the galaxy did not close. When the cicatrix maledictum tore the night sky, the great rift, the screaming scar of raw warp energy that split the Imperium in two, something changed. The boundaries between nightmare and real space thinned. The laws of distance, of time, of light, softened. Worlds that had once known only rumor and prayer, now knew visitation. The warp bled through, and Mortarion stepped out, not as memory, not as old terror, as presence, as certainty, as plague made flesh. There are reports, sanctioned, redacted, sometimes burned, of entire star systems darkening in weeks, not conquered by armies, not bombarded by fleets, but smothered. Lights going out one by one, astropathic choirs choking on their own blood mid-transmission. Planetary defense forces reporting atmospheric contamination moments before their final vox logs collapse into wet coughing and static. When the first Imperial forces arrived to investigate, they did not find battlefields. They found gardens, forests of weeping growth blossoming from the steel of hive cities. Plague winds moving through the avenues like incense. Statues of the Emperor covered in a soft living film of spore and lichen, gently pulsing like something asleep. And in the distance, high above the infected clouds, a shape drifted through the sky like a funeral angel. Winged, vast, heavy with perfection and ruin. Mortarion had returned to Realspace. He fell upon the worlds of Ultramar. Roboot Guilliman's realm, the realm of order and rebuilding, of clean light and stable rule. This was not coincidence. Mortarion holds no love for Guilliman, the Primarch who still dares to walk as a symbol of Imperial hope. Nor does he respect Guilliman's certainty that humanity can still be mended, that law and structure and clarity can still hold back the long night. To Mortarion, that kind of hope is not noble, it is denial, and denial must be corrected. So he brought his correction. He brought plague. The invasion of Ultramar was not a siege in the old sense. It was a saturation. The plague fleets arrived like drifting tombs, trailing clouds of rot through void space. Their hulls were not metal anymore. They were swollen, blistered living things. They birthed boarding craft that looked like diseased organs. They shed spores into the atmosphere of entire worlds. They unleashed plagues with names that are not spoken. Plagues not designed to kill quickly, but to unravel meaning. On some worlds, language itself began to break down. Citizens tried to call for help and found their words turning to phlegm. Scriptures rotted into formless stains in the hands of priests. Orders became moans. Panic became a chorus. This is Mortarion's way now. Not just to kill the body, to rot identity, to rot culture, to rot certainty, because when certainty fails, resistance follows, and when resistance fails, everything becomes quiet. And Mortarion loves the quiet. Imperial commanders who faced him in this age describe an aura of despair so thick it felt physical, not psychic terror. That belongs to the warp sorcerers of Tzeentch. Not ecstatic madness. That is the gift of Slaanesh. Not furious frenzy, that is Khorne's hymn. Number. This was resignation. Men who had trained their whole lives to fight, to hold the line, to call down orbital fire if needed, simply stopped. They laid down their weapons. They knelt in contaminated mud and let the spores take root in their lungs like seedlings in soft earth. Some even smiled. Because the cruel secret of Nurgle's blessing is this: it eases fear, it muffles pain, it makes surrender feel like being held. And Mortarion is the hand that holds them down. When Guilliman himself returned to confront Mortarion, the galaxy felt for a heartbeat like something out of ancient legend. Two Primarchs, two living demigods of a shattered age, one carrying the dream of a clean, lawful Imperium, the other carrying the certainty of universal decay. One brother in shining armor, reborn through forbidden means to save humanity. One brother in bloated rust, reborn through damnation to end its lie. They met not just as warriors, but as philosophies in collision. Guilliman spoke of duty, survival, unity, hope. Mortarion spoke of honesty. He told his brother that hope was a cruelty, that to promise salvation to mortals who will die screaming is not kindness. It is vanity. He told Guilliman that the Emperor was no god, only a tyrant who refused to rot. He told Guilliman that in death all things become equal, and that equality is mercy. Then he tried to give that mercy to Ultramar. To the worlds that witnessed them, it was not a battle between men. It was like watching two forces of nature collide. Guilliman, precise, blinding, relentless order given walking form. Mortarion, patient, heavy, inevitable ruin given wings. Where Robut struck, plague burned away in blue-white light, reality hardening around him, the Emperor's will burning like a contained star. Where Mortarion swept his scythe, the air itself curdled, flesh swelled and split, steel pitted and ran like wax. Faith faltered. As they fought, space buckled with raw warp energy, and mortal soldiers nearby simply dropped to their knees, their bodies unable to endure the spiritual pressure. To be near them was to feel history trying to decide which future it preferred. Clean rule, or beautiful rot. In the end, Mortarion did not die. Demon Primarchs do not die in any comforting sense. They retreat, they are pulled back, they are reclaimed. He was drawn back into the warp, back into the plague planet, back into the embrace of the grandfather who remade him. But this was not defeat, this was demonstration. Mortarion had proven he could walk in Realspace again. He had proven he could reach any world he desired. He had proven that Guilliman's resurrection did not mean safety, it meant escalation. The return of one Primarch was answered by another. Hope was answered by decay. The Imperium called it a miracle that Ultramar was not lost. Mortarion called it a first taste. Across the Imperium Nihilus, the half of the galaxy cut off from Terra's light, the half drowning in madness and night, the plague fleet spread like mold in damp stone. Some worlds surrendered before his fleets even arrived, choosing a slow, warm death over starvation and chaos. Some begged him, some welcomed infection. It is easy to condemn them from safety. It is harder to judge when you are alone in the dark, with no astropathic choir, no navigator, no hope of reinforcement, and your children are already coughing blood. Mortarion understands desperation. He always has. That is why his gospel spreads. He does not promise glory. He does not promise victory. He does not promise that you will live. He promises only this: you will not suffer alone. You will not be judged for your weakness. You will be allowed to fall apart and still be loved for it. To a galaxy that is bleeding and exhausted, that is a powerful sermon. That is how decay becomes religion. That is how plague becomes mercy. That is how Mortarion wages war now. Not as conqueror, as comfort, as the last voice you hear when you cannot fight anymore, telling you softly, "It's all right. Let go." There is no such thing as an ending, not truly. Things do not stop. They change, they soften, they fade, they decay. And in that slow unraveling, something ancient finds joy. Because to decay is to return, to stop striving, to stop pretending, to become part of everything again. That is Nurgle's gift. That is Mortarion's gospel, the gift of decay. On the plague planet, time has no shape. The days bleed into each other like oil over water. The clouds are green and gold. The light is soft and heavy. The air hums with the breath of 1 billion unseen lives. It is not beautiful. It is not ugly. It simply is. At the center of that eternal storm, in a fortress built from bone, rust, and memory, Mortarion sits upon his throne. He does not move often. He does not need to. From here, he can feel everything, every infection, every death, every small mercy of surrender across the galaxy, each cough, each sigh, each final exhale before silence. He feels them all, not as power, as presence, as inevitability. He has become part of the universe's rhythm. He breathes in suffering and breathes out acceptance. When the Death Guard return from Realspace, they kneel before him. Their armor is rusted beyond repair. Their weapons drip with unholy filth. Their eyes glow with the dim light of endurance. They bring trophies, cities drowned in disease, hives turned to compost, fortresses melted into mud. Mortarion listens to their reports. He nods. He dismisses them with a wave. He does not praise them. He does not need to. They know the truth. They have done what must always be done. They have reminded the galaxy that life is temporary, and that there is peace in knowing that. Sometimes he walks the gardens that surround his keep. The flowers bloom in strange colors, pale yellows, corpse greens, and deep bruised purples. They open and close with the rhythm of breathing. Each exhale releases spores that sparkle like dust in sunlight. Insects crawl over the stones, their shells translucent, their wings whispering hymns. To any other eye, it would be horror. To Mortarion, it is serenity. Because everything here accepts itself. Nothing fights to stay pure, nothing denies what it will become. This, he thinks, is what peace looks like. It does not shout, it does not gleam, it simply waits. He sometimes imagines the Emperor still watches him. That somewhere deep within the immobile god body on Terra, that golden face still remembers the son who would not kneel. If so, Mortarion wonders what that gaze feels like. Pity, disappointment, fear? Or perhaps, after all this time, the Emperor finally understands that no empire lasts forever, that no perfection endures, that even a god will crumble into dust, and that this is not failure, it is completion. There are moments when the Plague Lord stands upon his balcony and looks toward the stars. They shimmer faintly through the warp-stained sky, like fireflies trapped behind fog. He wonders how many of them are already dead, their light still traveling through space, pretending they are still alive. He understands that illusion. He has lived it. He knows what it is to shine long after the soul has gone cold. Perhaps that is what humanity is now. Light from a dead star, still traveling, still pretending. And perhaps, when that light finally fades, he will be there to greet it. There is a legend whispered among the demons of Nurgle's court that Mortarion is the only one among them who does not laugh. The plague-bearers giggle. The great unclean ones roar with joy. The air itself trembles with the god's endless amusement. But Mortarion never laughs. When asked why, he simply says, "Because laughter is for the living." And yet there are times when even he almost smiles. When the rain falls thick and warm and the sound of distant bells tolls through the mist, and the garden sighs like a sleeping giant. In those moments, Mortarion feels something close to contentment. Not happiness, never that, but a weary kind of peace. There are still wars, of course. There will always be wars. The plague fleets sail again and again, their prows crowned with bells and blight. Mortarion sends them forth not out of anger, but out of duty. Because to let the galaxy forget decay would be to let it fall into the Emperor's delusion once more. He brings balance, he brings truth, he brings the end that must always follow beginning. And though mortals curse his name, they will one day thank him, not in words, in silence. Because when their worlds finally fall quiet, they will understand. The rot was never cruelty. It was completion. There are few who dare approach the Plague Lord's mountain now. Those who do, pilgrims, cultists, or desperate souls seeking an end to pain, are welcomed in a way. They are not greeted with cruelty. They are not turned away. They are simply allowed. They walk among the gardens, they breathe the air. They feel their bodies soften and their strength fade. They cough, they fall. And when they do, the soil beneath them opens gently, accepting them like a parent pulling a child into an embrace. Mortarion does not watch. He does not need to. This is faith in its truest form, quiet, unforced, absolute, and yet, sometimes in the softest hours, when even the warp is still, Mortarion dreams again. Not of Nurgle's garden, not of the plague planet of Barbarus. He dreams of the mountain where he once stood, scythe in hand, looking down through poisonous fog, toward the faint lights of human villages. He dreams of the air that burned his lungs. He dreams of the sound of his own breathing. He dreams of the moment before the Emperor came, the moment he still believed he could save them all. He wakes from these dreams in silence. He never speaks of them. He tells himself they mean nothing. But somewhere in that decaying heart something stirs, a shadow of the man who once hated gods. And the garden listens, so the Death Lord endures, not as villain, not as savior, as truth. He is the shadow of mortality cast across eternity, the echo that follows every heartbeat, the sigh that follows every prayer. He is not cruel, he is not kind, he simply is. And as the stars flicker out one by one, and the galaxy drifts toward the quiet at the end of all things, Mortarion will still be there, not to conquer, not to rule, but to welcome. To spread his arms wide and whisper the only mercy that still matters. Rest. You have suffered enough. And so, the Death Guards sleep beneath their rotting stars, their wars unending, their prayers soft and wet in the dark. Mortarion does not rest. He simply endures. And perhaps that is rest enough. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking through the rot with me. In the end, all things fade, But stories, like Decay, always find new soil. Tell me, whose tale should I whisper next? Should we wander into the madness of Tzeentch, or drift through the endless laughter of Slaanesh? Leave your thoughts below, and together we'll dream deeper into the grim darkness of the far future. Until then, breathe slow, sleep well, and remember, even in decay, there is peace.